You've probably never heard of Picher, Oklahoma. And honestly, why would you? It doesn't appear on tourist maps. There are no billboards pointing the way and no welcoming signs on the highways. Yet, hidden within this quiet stretch of northeastern Oklahoma, just beneath the surface, lies a story, a true story, one that needs no embellishment or drama because the reality itself is haunting enough. It begins, as many American stories do, with a discovery. In the late 1800s, when the country was still stretching its legs and dreaming big, miners discovered something valuable beneath the rocky soil of this area. It wasn't gold or oil, though it might as well have been. It was lead and zinc, metals buried deep within the earth, locked in stone, the kind of discovery capable of turning an empty patch of dirt into a full-blown gold rush. Almost overnight, that's precisely what happened. Picher wasn't even marked on any map yet, but suddenly people flooded in, miners, laborers, and families chasing the promise of prosperity. The land was cracked open, carved out by hand and machine, and the wealth it yielded built more than fortunes. It built a thriving, vibrant town.
So, welcome to Mystery with Minnie.
By the 1920s and 30s, Picher had evolved into a bustling mining hub with over 14,000 residents. Schools were filled with children, churches echoed with hymns, and local shops lined the busy streets. Life in Picher meant steady work and strong community roots, and you could feel the pulse of progress, this sense that the residents had found something lasting and meaningful. In many ways, they had. The lead extracted from Picher was critical to America's development. It fueled World War I, built bridges, skyscrapers, and entire cities. Picher wasn't just sustaining itself, it was sustaining a nation, and its residents wore that pride openly and proudly. But beneath the pride lurked something darker, something people either couldn't see or chose not to acknowledge. When you dig deep into the earth, it rarely gives back cleanly. In Picher, the byproduct of mining was a substance known as chat, huge piles of crushed rock and fine white dust. It seemed harmless, almost natural. Locals treated these chat piles as part of their everyday landscape. Children played on them, trucks drove through them, and some residents even used the material in their driveways and sandboxes. But the chat was far from harmless. It was contaminated with lead. As life carried on above ground, babies were born, children played, prayers were whispered. The contamination below spread silently and invisibly. It was a poison without taste or smell, unnoticed by the residents for years. After all, this was a town built on toughness, and people weren't quick to complain. And realistically, what choice did they have? Could they simply stop mining and walk away from everything they'd built? For decades, the danger remained hidden and ignored until, gradually, it could no longer be overlooked. By the 1970s, doctors started noticing troubling patterns, developmental delays, behavioral problems, and lead poisoning. The number of affected children wasn't small. It was significant enough to raise alarms. Reports were filed, questions asked, and soon, what had been quietly ignored became an undeniable crisis. In 1979, the Environmental Protection Agency intervened, placing Picher on its national priorities list for cleanup, a formal acknowledgement that this community was dangerously contaminated and urgently needed help. Yet even then, change didn't come swiftly. By the time actions were taken, the damage was deeply rooted. The lead contamination had infiltrated the soil, water, air, and, worst of all, the bodies of the residents, especially the children. The contamination wasn't the only danger. Decades of mining had left the ground itself unstable. The abandoned mines had hollowed out the earth, making it brittle and unsafe. Streets began to crack, yards dipped unevenly, and beneath the seemingly normal surface, parts of the town slowly collapsed. Despite these dangers, many residents stayed. Some lacked the resources to leave, while others refused out of loyalty and deep emotional ties. This was home, where their parents and grandparents had lived, where their children had taken their first steps. Leaving wasn't something easily done. Thus, Picher existed in a strange and painful limbo. On the surface, the town appeared alive. Flags continued to wave, lights illuminated the nights. But beneath this facade, everything was quietly, devastatingly unraveling. The wealth that had once poured so easily from the earth had disappeared long ago, and what remained wasn't prosperity. You've probably never heard of. By the time the 1990s rolled around, you could feel it in the air. Picher was slowly slipping away. It didn't happen overnight. There was no single moment when everyone simply got up and left, no dramatic scene marked by sirens or fences going up. Instead, the town gradually faded, piece by piece, house by house, in the kind of slow decline that's hard to notice until suddenly you're standing right in the middle of it, looking around and wondering where everyone went. Businesses began to close their doors, not because of competition, but because their customers were disappearing. Classrooms that once held 20 children dwindled down to 4. The local grocery store now had entire aisles you no longer walked through, simply because there wasn't enough stock to fill the shelves. Streets that had once hummed with conversations and car engines grew quieter, not entirely silent, but still enough to feel unsettling. All the while, the invisible threats, the lead contamination, the toxic chat piles, and the unstable ground continued their slow, relentless creep. Some didn't see it happening, or perhaps chose not to, but if you were really paying attention, it became impossible to ignore. The Environmental Protection Agency had been working on cleanup efforts since the late 70s, but by the late 90s, it was painfully clear that Picher wasn't just polluted, it was saturated. The damage extended far deeper than the soil. It had rooted itself in people's bodies, in their daily routines, and even in their memories. No cleanup crew, armed with shovels and hazmat suits, could remove that kind of contamination. The chat piles, once just background scenery and accepted as part of daily life, were now recognized for what they truly were: massive mountains of poison. Generations of children had played on these piles. Families had lived alongside them, unaware that these seemingly harmless hills of white dust had been silently poisoning the town for decades. The proof was painfully evident in the statistics. Rates of lead poisoning in Picher's children soared far above the national average. Lead poisoning isn't something that simply goes away like a common cold. It lingers, permanently affecting brain development, motor skills, and attention spans. Parents watched helplessly as their children struggled, searching desperately for answers. Was it something in the water, the air, or the soil? Eventually, the heartbreaking realization settled in. It was everything. But the crisis wasn't only about health. Beneath the town itself, the earth was literally crumbling. For years, the mines underneath Picher had been hollowed out, creating a sprawling network of tunnels and shafts that ran beneath the town like veins. With no one maintaining these structures, they became old, unstable, and increasingly dangerous. Areas began to collapse. Engineers arrived to map hazardous zones, and soon signs appeared, warning of potential cave-ins. Parts of the town were condemned, fences went up, and residents were urged to stay out or stay away. Yet, despite all these warnings, many residents still chose to stay, because leaving wasn't as simple as just packing up and moving on. For some families, this place was all they had ever known. It was the house Grandma had lived in, the town where their father had earned his first paycheck, the community where they attended church, went to school, and gathered at the diner on Saturdays. You don't easily walk away from your entire life, not unless you're forced to. Some residents simply didn't believe the situation was as dire as reported. Others believed it but lacked the financial means to leave. And some couldn't bear the emotional weight of saying goodbye. But eventually, the goodbyes became inevitable. In 2006, the schools closed because there simply weren't enough students left to justify keeping them open, a devastating blow for the community. Losing its school meant losing its heartbeat. Soon after, the post office shut down too, bringing an end to incoming mail, checks and birthday cards. All that remained was silence. By 2009, the reality was undeniable. Picher had become a ghost town in all but name. The government began offering buyouts, and even those families who had initially resisted started packing up, loading their belongings into U-Hauls and leaving behind far more than they took with them. Some left with tears in their eyes, others simply looked weary. Yet through it all, the chat piles remained. They stood quietly, their edges glowing bright white in the Oklahoma sun, as if daring anyone who saw them to forget what had happened here. But no one forgot. You don't forget a town where children became sick just from playing in the dirt, where the ground beneath your feet could literally collapse, and where families watched helplessly as their hometowns slowly disappeared due to something they couldn't even see. By the time the last boxes were packed and the final moving trucks rumbled away, Picher didn't feel much like a town anymore. Instead, it felt more like a photograph left out in the sun, faded at the edges, curling inward, and almost too fragile to touch. There were no parades marking its end, no big headlines in the newspapers, just silence. A strange, echoing stillness settled in after the last school bell rang, after the final sermons were delivered, after the post office locked its doors for good. The streets remained, as did the houses, but they were empty now. Gone were the familiar footsteps, the comforting smell of coffee brewing in the morning, and the laughter bouncing from front porch to front porch. What remained were buildings standing quietly like ghosts, holding memories of a version of themselves that no one inhabited anymore. Nature wasted no time reclaiming what had been left behind. Grass began to push through sidewalks, weeds twisted around fences, and windows shattered by storms remained unrepaired. The playground quietly rusted in the wind, its swings occasionally creaking, as if the town itself were trying to speak, even if no one was around to listen. Yet, despite everything, you could still feel it. The life that had once thrived there, the weight of all those lived experiences. The town wasn't merely abandoned, it felt suspended, caught somewhere between what it had been and what it had become. Every street corner seemed to hold on to its stories. A birthday celebrated, a first kiss shared, a final goodbye whispered, layered deeply into the dust, like sediment in a riverbed. For a short while, a handful of residents lingered, whether out of defiance, heartbreak, or sheer stubborn love for their hometown. They stayed, mowing their lawns, keeping porch lights lit, and pretending the town wasn't quietly unraveling around them. But slowly, inevitably, even those final lights flickered out. In 2008, a powerful storm tore through Picher like a final exclamation point. Buildings that had barely managed to hold together were ripped apart, homes were reduced to splinters, and for many of the few residents who had stubbornly remained, the storm was the final blow. It took what the mines, the lead, and the poisoned soil hadn't already claimed. By 2009, when the federal government offered the last round of voluntary buyouts, nearly everyone took them. With that, Picher quietly crossed an invisible line, moving from a dying town to a town already gone. By 2017, not a single resident officially remained. What stayed behind felt less like an actual place and more like a memory given physical form. Roads faded back into gravel, buildings slowly caved in, and the land itself, still unstable, still poisoned, lay quiet, heavy, and still. But here's the strange thing. Even in its decay, Picher possessed a peculiar kind of beauty. A haunting beauty, the kind that makes you stop in your tracks, not because of what you see, but because of what you feel. You can gaze down an empty street and see nothing, and yet somehow see everything. The shadows of what once existed remain vivid. It's all still there, just beneath the surface. And within that silence, one question still lingers even today. How did it come to this? How does a town go from feeding a nation to being erased from the map? The answer isn't simple. It wasn't only the lead or the mines or greed. It was hundreds of small decisions, made over decades, repeatedly choosing profit over people, deliberately looking the other way, and believing that ignoring the warnings would somehow make the consequences vanish. But the consequences always catch up, and in Picher, they caught up with everything. Even now, years after the last family packed up and left, Picher hasn't truly disappeared. Yes, it's off the map, the homes have vanished, the church pews stand empty, and the school is nothing more than rubble slowly reclaimed by wild grass. But Picher still exists, in stories, in memories, and in the quiet, lingering silence it left behind. It's one of those places that stays with you, even long after you've stopped looking at the photographs. Because what happened here wasn't simply some environmental accident, it was deeply personal. It unfolded slowly, yes, but it happened to real people. Families, children with scraped knees and report cards proudly displayed on the fridge, and people who genuinely believed in their town. They trusted this place. They built their entire lives on ground they believed would support them, protect them, and care for them. But it didn't. Instead, the very earth beneath their feet betrayed them. The lead contamination was invisible. The underground cracks and empty mines weren't marked on any map. And by the time the truth emerged, by the time residents fully understood that they weren't just living in danger, but that their home itself had become dangerous, it was already far too late. What remains now is a warning, one we simply can't afford to overlook. Because Picher isn't just an isolated tragedy. It's a mirror reflecting something bigger, something important. It serves as a powerful reminder that progress comes with costs, real human costs. And if we keep digging without consideration, building without caution, extracting resources without care, this story won't remain an exception. It could become the blueprint. But here's where I find hope. The people of Picher didn't simply vanish. They carried their stories forward with them. Some relocated to nearby towns, others ventured further away, and a few even became involved in environmental advocacy, determined to protect other communities from the same fate. And some just kept quietly living their lives, but with a strength that can only come from having survived something so deeply profound. You can still see it in their faces during interviews and in old reunion photos posted online. It's a quiet defiance, a small, weary smile that says, "Yes, I'm from Picher, and despite it all, I'm still here." Because they are still here, and that matters. Maybe the town itself is gone, maybe the signs are down and the post office doors are permanently boarded up, but the story of Picher remains very much alive. It needs to be remembered and shared, not merely as a tragedy, but as an important lesson, a cautionary tale, a kind of echo from the past that we can listen to, learn from, and perhaps use to prevent another town from suffering the same fate. If this story moved you, even just a little, don't forget to drop a thumbs up. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today. Until next time, stay curious.